Hi, it's Neil from Geeson Training. Today we're going to share Joe's story with you. This video will give you an insight to how Joe first started gambling, the effects in his and his family's lives, as well as his mental health.
Yeah, so my name's Joe. I'm a recovering gambling addict. I'm 32. I probably first started experiencing harmful gambling when I was at secondary school. I remember being around age 13, 14, something like that, and playing a game called Penny Up, which was where we used small change and basically tried to throw coins towards a wall, and whoever got their coin the closest won all of them, really. And I remember at that time, for the first time, lying about gambling. And so to me, although I'm not necessarily saying I was an addict at that point, I knew that there was something that wasn't quite right. So I would gamble my dinner money, playing that game, and I would go home and my parents would ask me, what I had to eat that day at school, and I would lie to them. So that's the first point when I remember gambling starting to become harmful, when the deceit started. So then did that through school, and then left school, went to college. Again, the gambling continued, obviously still underage at this point, so my opportunities to gamble were restricted by that. But I played cards with friends, might have played some fruit machines in pubs and bars, that kind of thing. Although I'd still describe it as harmful, it was something that I was probably hiding. It wasn't, the impact of it wasn't significant, mainly because I was limited so much by the fact I was under 18. But then I remember going to university, and it was really at the point when I reached age 18 that things really started to kick off. Obviously I was of legal age then. Going to university meant that I was a lot more independent. There was a lot more distance between myself and my family and friends. I had access to a lot more money, and my gambling just skyrocketed, basically. At that point I was just betting on sports, things that I had a genuine interest in. And I remember, I think it was when I was about 18, I placed a £5 bet, and I ended up winning somewhere in the region of £1,000, and it sticks out in my memory because I remember thinking, wow, it's so much cash. I remember having a £50 note for the first time, and I remember just feeling like on top of the world, really. But then I also remember thinking how easy it felt, which looking back now, I know that it's not, but at that time I felt it was incredibly easy, and so I suppose that just added to my enthusiasm for it, really, and it became a regular occurrence. Still probably only weekly, but I was just wanting to pursue that win again. But then I remember one particular weekend when I'd gone into the bookies to place my usual sports bet, and I saw one of my friends from uni playing a fixed odds betting terminal, or an FOBT, and he was playing, I think, blackjack and roulette on there, and he turned £10 into somewhere in the region of 150 within about 15 minutes, and I just could not believe it. And I remember asking him to show me what to do, how do you play it, and then that was it. I was hooked, basically. From then, every week I was still going into the bookies, but I was putting my sports bet on, and then I was having a go on this machine, and then it just escalated from there. I was then going into the bookies and was there all afternoon rather than just for 15 minutes or half an hour. I wasn't just betting the money that I'd set aside for betting, I was betting every last penny. It was at that point that I started to borrow money to gamble, so clearly my gambling was becoming unaffordable at that point, and the FOBTs just basically became like my crack cocaine, really, and it gave me the opportunity to gamble 24/7, and that was just so dangerous for me. It had a huge impact on my education. Throughout university, I blew probably about 80% of my student loan on gambling. I missed lectures, essay deadlines, I was up all night gambling, and it had a huge impact on my education, and I wasn't able to secure the degree that I was capable of getting because of my gambling, I ended up leaving with a diploma, which I was fortunate to get, to be honest. It was also, I think, at that point that it started to impact my relationships, certainly with my parents. The stakes were just increasing all the time, and I was getting myself into financial difficulty, and that meant that I had to go speak to my parents. So I went to them and I told them that I had some issues with gambling, but at that time I had no real desire to address the problem. I wouldn't have even referred to myself as an addict at that point. They agreed to help me, I suppose, like any parent would, and I just told them everything I think they wanted to hear. I told them that my willpower would be enough, that I could control this, but knowing in myself that just wasn't going to happen. But the type of person that I was at that time, I thought nothing of being deceitful. As I say, I just told them everything that I felt they wanted to hear. All I was interested in doing was getting the financial support from them to essentially free me up to gamble again. So I went through university, came out with a diploma, came out with a lot of debt, and by that point I was definitely an addict. I perhaps wasn't admitting it to myself, but I absolutely was. And then left university, and I met my long-term partner. She very quickly became aware of my harmful gambling, of my addiction, and she was very supportive. But as I'd done with my parents, I let her down. I lied to her, and I just continued to gamble, and the stakes were just increasing all the time. And it wasn't just me using my student loan. I was now borrowing from anyone and everyone, really. My credit rating was impacted at this point, which then limited my borrowing ability and meant that any borrowing that I could do was restricted to your typical like payday loan lenders. So the interest was much greater, and basically over a number of probably like 4 or 5 years, I just continued to lie to my partner, lie to my parents, tell them that my willpower would be enough, not really take any steps to address my addiction, because I just didn't have that desire to do it, which I needed. During that time, I stole from my partner. Told so many lies on top of lies. I think, in my experience as an addict, deceit, dishonesty, it becomes second nature. You become an expert in manipulation, and I used all of those skills to basically manipulate situations for my benefit. So whether it was, wanting money to pay off some debts, or wanting money to gamble, or, whatever it was, as I say, you become an expert in those kind of things. It got to the point where we needed to take some practical steps because it was just becoming so destructive. So I went down the route of things like self-exclusion. I handed over my finances to my partner. There are other practical steps that I took, but my addiction was so powerful that they weren't going to be enough on their own. To kind of give you an example, I self-excluded from betting shops in my local area, but would think nothing of driving 100 miles just to a shop that I knew that they couldn't refuse. They couldn't refuse me entering. So those practical steps probably limited the gambling, but didn't stop it. It got to the point where we wanted to buy a house. We should have been in the position to be able to buy a house, but my credit rating was just so poor, so poor. And as my credit rating started to deteriorate, I then had to look away from high street lenders and look at companies like payday lenders, other forms of borrowing where the interest rate was just astronomical. So I was drowning in debt, but she was supporting me with that. But it just meant we had absolutely no chance of getting a mortgage, not a joint one anyway. And to be fair, even if it was affordable, my partner didn't want me on the mortgage because she was worried about what power that might give me, in terms of could I use that to free up some money to fund my gambling. And I think that just shows the lens that I was going to at that time to get my fix, if you like. We did manage to get a house, but the mortgage had to be in her name only. We did manage to get married. Again, we were supported by our parents. Without that, it wouldn't have been possible. My partner worked very hard to find the money for the wedding. We went to New Zealand on our honeymoon for 3 weeks, and I remember at the time that was the longest period I'd gone without gambling in probably about 10 years, and that was only because it just wasn't accessible to me. But I got back from the honeymoon, and all those promises I'd made in the vows, everything that I'd said to my partner's parents when I'd asked them if I could take their daughter's hand in marriage, I just went against them, you know, and I was back at it hard again. We fell pregnant, which was great. The pregnancy wasn't straightforward. Our son was born in quite difficult circumstances. He was premature. My wife had gone through a lot, and then even in that situation, you know, if you're thinking by this point, well, if my degree wasn't enough, if my education wasn't enough to stop me, you know, if my relationship with my parents wasn't enough, maybe when I got married I'd finally realise things had to stop. But no. But then surely when you have a son, someone who's dependent upon you, surely that's enough to stop. But it wasn't, and I think that just shows the strength of my addiction, really. I continue to gamble. I gambled money that we should have used for him. I didn't hesitate to use money for that should have been for him, whether, you know, if I had money to go to the shop to buy nappies or whatever it was, I would gamble that money. I'd gamble every last penny that I had. It was all I was interested in doing, and the trust had completely broken down by this point. And eventually, my wife plucked up the courage to do something she should have done a long time ago, and she ended our relationship, and that was the right thing for her. She stood by me for far too long, and I think, when I talk to people about my addiction, one of the first questions I always get is, how much money did you lose? And I'm happy to share that. It was an astronomical amount of money, somewhere in the region of probably about £110,000, but I can pay that money back. What I can't do is repair all of the hurt and the loss, and repair all of the relationships that I've destroyed as a result of my addiction. You know, my marriage being one of those. So then, at that point, I reached rock bottom. I'd used that term so many times in the past, but I wasn't there. But this really was rock bottom. You know, I was absolutely desperate. But with desperation comes a gift, in my opinion. You know, people say the only way is up, and it really was for me. I sought recovery. I went back to a fellowship. I applied myself to a recovery program. I took further practical steps to limit my ability to gamble. I opened up to more people about my addiction, and I found recovery. And one day at a time, I got to, I think it was 66 days clean, which up until that point, the 3 weeks in New Zealand had been the longest period of abstinence. I'd now got to just over 2 months. But at this point, like, the mist had started to clear, and I was overwhelmed with guilt about what I'd done to all the people that cared for me, that loved me and supported me, and also I was struggling without gambling, to be brutally honest. You know, it's something that I'd done every day, you know, pretty much for 10, 15 years, and now, you know, I'd stopped, and it was a cold turkey period. And although it's not a substance addiction, it's behavioural, it did very much feel like cold turkey, and it was really, really tough, and it had a huge impact on my mental health. I was drowning in debt as well, and that was definitely a contributing factor. Faced with all the loss and all the hurt, I could see what it was doing to everybody. I could see what my addiction was doing, what the breakdown from my relationship was doing to everyone, and things escalated. I got into a negative thought cycle, and I tried to end my life on the 19th of February. That wasn't successful, which I'm grateful for. But to me, at that point, it just highlighted how, I suppose, ignorant I'd been with regards to the impact this was having on my mental health. And from that point onwards, I decided to focus not only on my gambling addiction recovery, but also on my mental health recovery. I received incredible support from a number of health professionals. I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression, both of which were exacerbated by my addiction. I took steps in terms of medication and therapy to try and support my recovery with the mental health issues, and that's going well. I think I was a typical young male really, and not wanting to talk about my mental health struggles. I think the fact that a lot of them were linked to gambling addiction probably meant that my pride got in the way, and there's a lot of shame and a lot of embarrassment. But yeah, here I am, over 130 days clean now. My life is definitely better. There's still a lot of hurt, a lot of loss. I've still got a lot of debt. It's going to take a long time to recover, but I'm getting there one day at a time. And if I can do it, I had 10, 15 years of gambling every single day. I've stolen from people, I've borrowed, money from people that I shouldn't have borrowed from. I've sacrificed so many relationships. I've put my friends and my family through so much, and I have somehow managed to find recovery. So if I can do it, then anybody can. Through the fellowship that I'm a member of, I've seen people where addiction has pushed them to take their life. Addiction has pushed them to commit crimes. It is incredibly powerful, incredibly toxic, incredibly, destructive, but you can beat it. For me, it's about accepting that I am an addict, and it's about knowing what I can change and what I can't, and the choices that I am able to make now are the right ones, really. If there's anybody watching this that is concerned about their own gambling or the gambling of someone that's close to them, I would just encourage them to kind of ask themselves some questions. Is their gambling affordable? To me, very early on, I started to borrow money just to gamble. My gambling was not affordable at that point. Is your gambling affecting your relationships? Mine absolutely was. I was lying to cover my gambling, and that was affecting the trust. Is your gambling affecting your health, both physical and mental health? At Christmas, when I just come off the bet, when I'd kind of found recovery, I actually collapsed and broke my collarbone, and had some issues with my heart. And addiction is incredibly powerful, and it has pushed me to my absolute physical and mental limits. So, if it's affecting your health, either mental or physical, or you answer yes to either of those other two questions, then it's time to take action. The two pillars for me that have been fundamental in my recovery is talking and being honest. And when I say being honest, first and foremost with yourself. If I'd have watched this video 5-10 years ago, I'd have probably watched it with someone and thought, yeah, that's not me. That's not me. I don't have an addiction. My gambling isn't like that. But I thought that at one point. I never thought gambling would push me to want to take my own life. I never thought gambling would stop me, being able to buy a house. I never thought my gambling would, result in the breakdown of my marriage. I never thought my gambling would push me to steal from people, but it did. So, just intervene. Just be honest with yourself. Is your gambling harmful? And, to me, coming off the bet was incredibly scary. My addiction scares me now, but the prospect of not betting, I found that terrifying. And I get that, and it does take a lot of courage to kind of, to intervene, but it is absolutely worth it. My life is so much better now, gambling free. On the talking bit as well, try and find someone that you can talk to. There are plenty of charities out there that you can speak to on a confidential basis. If you do have the courage to look up to someone close to you, please do it. Despite everything that I've done to all the people around me, I've been overwhelmed with support. People recognise this as, a toxic disease. People recognise that the decisions that I made under the influence of that gambling addiction were not necessarily just my own. People will understand. If you take steps to try and address, and people are able to see that, they will support you. So that would be my advice.
If you or someone you care about have an addiction problem, then this may have started by way of coping with feelings that you or they have felt unable to deal with. We understand that mental health and addiction problems are sensitive subjects, but Geeson Training's key message from these videos are to access the vast amount of confidential help that is out there. For more information about addiction and sources of support, you can speak to your trainer or see the links below in the description.